All right. So in this video, we are going to build a class for the dog bones of our dog or whatever you've created. But if you were following along with the last video, this is the code that was left off. I'll include a link to it. And it is where if you click on the dog bone, the mouse moves up and down. But what I want now is a lot more dog bones. And the best way to do this is to create a class. So in the previous video, we saw why a class is desirable in this case, because you can have a lot of different objects stored in variables and can access their position, in this case their rotation, and you can create methods, so functions that apply to each object in that class, where we can move each dog bone individually. We can check for collisions and do a lot more conveniently with this class definition. So if you look at this code, the two dog bones here were drawn in these two lines where we call the dog bone function and pass into it parameter for the X position, Y position, and the rotation. So what we're going to do is change this from a function into making this the bone class. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is create a new JavaScript file for the bone class. Now, this is a convention to have class definitions be in a separate file. So in addition to the sketch.js, another file that would store the class code. But in general, as your code scales up, you might want to have more than one file to keep everything organized. So if you check this out, so yours right now probably looks like this. If you hit this little caret at the left, it will open up the files that are happening behind the scenes. So besides just the sketch file, there's also an HTML and a CSS file. So if you're familiar with doing this before, you know what these are. For now, we're not going to cover it. Just do this, and then it will start to make sense later. So if you look at the index.html, there is a line right here that links to sketch.js. So that's our sketch file here. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that line with Shift, Command, or Control D. And what we want to do is create a new file and link to it, and let's call it bone.js. Okay, great. And I'm going to save this. And then to create a new file, if you go to this sketch, this little downward arrow next to sketch files, let's go add file, and let's name it bone.js. Add file. Awesome. So now we have bone.js. If we click on it, it's empty. Let's make sure it's working. I think this should work. Can we just console.log bone.js is live. 3 exclamation points. Oops, got to close that up with another. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to run it, and here we see that this line of code that's in bone.js is indeed live because we got this message in the console. So I'm just going to delete that. Okay, so to start with creating the class, I'm just going to copy, I'm going to fold this draw bone function that we created. Going to cut it out of there, Command X, save this, and then go to bone.js and paste it there. So we're going to restructure this into a class. Now, class basic syntax. I like this reference. It is javascript.info, which is an online book, which you can also purchase as a PDF. But I like their definitions because they're super simple. If you look at W3 Schools or Mozilla Developer, this kind of lays it out neatly. So let's look at class syntax. The basic syntax, let's see, maybe you can make this bigger so you can read it. The basic syntax is you start with the word class. So that initializes it as a class. And then notice that the class is capitalized. So when we've been defining variables and other functions, the first letter is lowercase. But the convention for a class is to capitalize it. And then we have this function called constructor. Now this is built in to the class setup. And the constructor will be the thing that is fired, that first initializes your class object. Okay, and methods, these are function definitions. And so methods are basically functions, but they apply specifically to your class object. And notice when they're defined here, you don't need to have the word function first. You can just list them and define them. And so this right here, this whole class setup is the cookie cutter that will create your different class objects. And the traditional metaphor that they use in CS history, really, for defining a class is a car. So if you have a car class, each car has windows, each car has color, each car has wheels, windows, wheels, you get it, like the basic shape. And the class objects or the car class, as you define it, will create this blueprint, but allow you to change the color or the model or the speed. We'll do it with the bone, and then it will, I think, become more clear. Okay, so let's go back to our web editor. And I'm just going to comment this out. We're just going to keep it here as a reference. So we have a class that we're creating, and the syntax is class bone, and I'm capitalizing that. And let's see, let's double check. Oops, class basic syntax. Oh, so look, there's not two parentheses after it. You just start with the curly bracket. Awesome. So we don't need those. We just have the curly bracket. Close that off. And then we have this constructor function. Constructor. Let's go back to our syntax. Yes, constructor. And this is where we define our initial stuff. Okay, so constructor. So in this constructor, we're going to define all the variables that apply to our bone. And the ones that we're using right here are the X position, Y position, and rotation. So here's where things get a little tricky in setting up a class. So in the arguments that go inside this constructor function, arguments or parameters, will be the same three things that were in this function. Okay. But these are just like temporary variables that are being passed into it. And every time that you create a class object, as you pass these into the constructor function, then you also have to say this dot xpos equals xpos. Okay, so just hold on. This will make more sense in a second. This dot ypos equals ypos. And this dot rotation equals rotation. So what the fuck is going on here? This, the word this, you see this all the time in JavaScript, and it refers to this individual bone that you're creating. So this bone, this, has this X position. Now the reason that you have to duplicate it here is because these temporary variables are just being passed in and then reassigned to this particular bone. So the fact that they have the same naming can be a little confusing. So one thing that you might see that I like to use is, and I'm holding down command to do the multi-cursor, super cool. Code superpower. And I'm going to add an underscore in front of each of these. And this just makes it a little clearer that this is the same as this, but this right here is something new. So we're just taking this temporary value and then passing it into this. Okay, cool. Now, the next thing that we need to do is set up different methods. So these are functions specific to our class object that will do different things to it. Well, what do we need to do to it? The first thing we need to do is draw the bone to the board, so display it. So I'm going to create a method called display, parentheses, curly brackets to follow, and I always make the second curly bracket at the same time that I write the first so we don't get any mismatch brackets. Okay, display. And again, when you're defining methods inside this class setup, you don't need to write function before it. You can just write the name of the method. And so what goes inside this display function? Guess what? It is this whole drawing the bone from here, from our initial function. So I'm just going to grab all of that, copy it. I'm going to paste it into here, and then I'm going to uncomment it with command /. Okay, but something else needs to happen. Ooh, I'm going to hit Shift-Tab to tidy up all the indentation. So something else needs to happen because this X pause here is now doesn't exist. Or actually, that's not true. It still exists. Let's fix this. It still exists over here in our original sketch function. Oh, just kidding. Because it only existed in that function definition for drawing the dog tail. So nope, forget what I just said. Okay, so going back to bone.js. So this exposition now is actually this .exposition. So whenever you refer to variables within your class setup, unless they're global variables, the ones that are referring just to this object need to refer to that object with the word this. So X position, Y position, rotation, every time these are mentioned in the code, which is just in those 3 lines, they need to be preceded with this .xpos. Okay, now I think this is all we need to set up the class. So I'm going to save this, run it. Let's just make sure we don't get any errors. Ooh, reference error, draw bone is not defined in sketch line 12. So I'm going to go back to my sketch file, line 12, and the reason we got this error is because this draw bone function doesn't exist anymore. We commented it out and we put it into a class. So I am going to comment out these 2 lines and then run the sketch again. Okay, no errors, but we don't see the bones yet. So now we have to initialize those 2 bones to draw them, and then we can do different stuff with them.